Section 25 of the Treasure Chest of My Bookhouse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Treasure Chest of My Bookhouse, edited by Olive Beaupre Miller. A Night Ride in a Prairie Schooner by Hamlin Garland. One afternoon in the autumn of 1868, Duncan Stewart, leading his little fleet of prairie schooners, entered upon the big prairie of northern Iowa, and pushed resolutely into the west. His 4-horse, canvas-covered wagon was followed by 2 other lighter vehicles, one of which was driven by his wife, and the other by a hired freighter. At the rear of all the wagons, and urging forward a dozen or 16 cattle, trotted a gaunt youth and a small boy. The boy had tears upon his face, and was limping with a stone bruise. He could hardly look over the wild oats, which tossed their gleaming bayonets in the wind, and when he dashed out into the blue joint and wild sunflowers, to bring the cattle into the road, he could be traced only by the ripple he made like a trout in a pool. He was a small edition of his father. He wore the same color and check in his hickory shirt, and his long pantaloons of blue denim had suspenders precisely like those of the men. Indeed, he considered himself a man, notwithstanding the tear stains on his brown cheeks. It seemed a long time since leaving his native Wisconsin coolly behind, with only a momentary sadness. But now, after nearly a week of travel, it seemed his father must be leading them all to the edge of the world, and Lincoln was very sad and weary. "Company, halt!" called the captain. One by one the teams stopped, and the cattle began to feed. They were always ready to eat, and Mr. Stewart, coming back where his wife sat, said cheerily, "Well, Kate, here's the big prairie I told you of, and beyond that blue line of timber you see is Sun Prairie and home." Mrs. Stewart did not smile. She was too weary, and the wailing of little Mary in her arms was dispiriting. "Come here, Lincoln," said Mr. Stewart. "Here we are, out of sight of the works of man. Not a horse in sight. Climb up here and see." Lincoln rustled along through the tall grass, and clambering up the wagon wheel, stood silently beside his mother. Tired as he was, the scene made an indelible impression on him. It was as though he had suddenly been transported into another world, a world where time did not exist, where snow never fell, and the grass waved forever under a cloudless sky. A great awe fell upon him as he looked, and he could not utter a word. At last Mr. Stewart cheerily called, "Attention, battalion! We must reach Sun Prairie tonight. Forward, march!" Again the little wagon train took up its slow way through the tall ranks of the wild oats and the drooping, flaming sunflowers. Slowly the sun sank. The crickets began to cry. The nighthawks whizzed and boomed, and long before the prairie was crossed the night had come. Being too tired to foot it any longer behind the cracking heels of the cows, Lincoln climbed into the wagon beside his little brother, who was already asleep, and resting his head against his mother's knee, lay for a long time, listening to the chuckle of the wheels, watching the light go out of the sky, and counting the stars as they appeared. At last they entered the wood, which seemed a very threatening place indeed, and his alert ears caught every sound, the hoot of owls, the quavering cry of coons, the twitter of night birds. But at last his weariness overcame him, and he dozed off, hearing the clank of the whipple trees, the creak of the horses' harness, the vibrant voice of his father, and the occasional cry of the hired hand urging the cattle forward through the dark. He was roused once by the ripple of a stream, wherein the horses thrust their hot nozzles. He heard the grind of wheels on the pebbly bottom, and the wild shouts of resolute men as they scrambled up the opposite bank, to thread once more the dark aisles of the forest. Here by the road was smoother, and to the soft rumble of the wheels the boy slept. At last, deep in the night, so it seemed to Lincoln, his father shouted, "Wake up, everybody! We're almost home." Then, facing the darkness, he cried, in Western fashion, "Hello, the house!" Dazed and stupid, Lincoln stepped down the wheel to the ground, his legs numb with sleep. Owen followed, querulous as a sick puppy, and together they stood in the darkness, waiting further command. From a small frame house near by, a man with a lantern appeared. "Hello!" he said, yawning with sleep. "Is that you, Stewart? I just about give you up." While the men unhitched the teams, Stewart helped his wife and children into the house, where Mrs. Hutcheson, a tall, thin woman, with a pleasant smile, made them welcome. She helped Mrs. Stewart remove her things, and then set out some bread and milk for the boys, which they ate in silence, their heavy eyelids drooping. When Mr. Stewart came in, he said, "Now, Lincoln, you and Will are to sleep in the other shack. Run along before you go to sleep. Owen will stay here." Without in the least knowing the why or wherefore, Lincoln set forth beside the hired man out into the unknown. They walked rapidly for a long time, and as his blood began to stir again, Lincoln awoke to the wonder and mystery of the hour. The strange grasses under his feet, the unknown stars over his head, the dim objects on the horizon, were all the fashioning of a mind in the world of dreams. At last they came to a small cabin on the banks of a deep ravine. Opening the door, the men lit a candle and spread their burden of blankets on the floor. Lincoln crept between them like a sleepy puppy, and in a few minutes this unknown actual world merged itself in the mystery of the dreams. When he awoke, the sun was shining, hot and red, through the open windows, and the men were smoking their pipes by the rough fence before the door. Lincoln hurried out to see what kind of world this was to which his night's journey had hurried him. It was, for the most part, a level land, covered with short grass intermixed with tall weeds, and with many purple and yellow flowers. A little way off, to the right, stood a small house, and about as far to the right was another, before which stood the wagons belonging to his father. Directly in front was a wide expanse of rolling prairie, cut by a deep ravine, while to the north, beyond the small farm, which was fenced, a still wider region rolled away into unexplored and marvelous distance. Altogether it was a land to exalt a boy who had lived all his life in a thickly settled Wisconsin coulee, where the horizon line was high and small of circuit. In less than 2 hours the wagons were unloaded, the stove was set up in the kitchen, the family clock was ticking on its shelf, and the bureau set against the wall. It was amazing to see how these familiar things and his mother's bustling presence changed the looks of the cabin. Little Mary was quite happy crawling about the floor, and Owen, who had explored the barn and found a lizard to play with, was entirely at home. Lincoln had climbed to the roof of the house, and was still trying to comprehend this mighty stretch of grasses. Sitting astride the roof board, he gazed away into the northwest, where no house broke the horizon, wondering what lay beyond the high ridge. While seated thus, he heard a distant roar and trample, and saw a cloud of dust rising along the fence, which bounded the farm to the west. It was like a rush of a whirlwind, and, before he could call to his father, out on the smooth sod to the south burst a platoon of wild horses, led by a beautiful roan mare. The boy's heart leaped with excitement as the shaggy colts swept around to the east, racing like wolves at play. Their long tails and abundant manes streamed in the wind like banners, and their imperious bugling voiced their contempt for man. Lincoln clapped his hands with joy, and all the family ran to the fence to enjoy the sight. A boy, splendidly mounted on a fleet roan, the mate of the leader, was riding at a slashing pace with intent to turn the troop to the south. He was a superb rider, and the little Morgan strove gallantly without need of whip or spur. He laid out like a hare. He seemed to float like a hawk, skimming on the weeds. His rider sat him like one born to the saddle, erect and supple, and of little hindrance to the beast. On swept the herd, circling to the left, heading for the wild lands to the east. Gallantly strove the roan with his resolute rider, disdaining to be beaten by his own mate, his breath roaring like a furnace, his nostrils blown like trumpets, his hoofs pounding the resounding sod, all in vain. Even with the inside track, he was no match for his wild, free mate. The herd drew ahead, and plunging through a short lane, vanished over a big swell to the east, and their drumming rush died rapidly away into silence. This was a glorious introduction to the life of the prairies, and Lincoln's heart filled with boundless joys, and longing to know it, all of it, east, west, north, and south. He had no further wish to return to his coulee home. The horseman had become his ideal, the prairie his domain. End of section 25.